The leadership of the Federal Board, the Federal Reserve System is mainly made up of 14 entities. 14 entities is the leadership. It's the main part of the Federal Reserve. But in totality, there's 3,000 American banks. All national banks has to go through the Fed, and then a lot of state banks apply to be a part of the Federal Reserve System. I mean, if you're a bank and you're part of the Fed system, well, you're set. You're fine. You're a bank anyways. You're going to do fine anyways. But the Federal Reserve is the one, they rig the economic system in favor of the banks and the corporations and Wall Street and whatnot. So the Fed, in totality, is 3,000 banks, plus the 14 entities. The leadership of the Federal Reserve are the 12 federal regional banks. So you have St. Louis Bank, you got Kansas City Bank, you got, Dallas. Is it Dallas or Austin? I don't know. Some bank in Texas. San Francisco Fed. So you got the St. Louis Fed, the San Francisco Fed, the Atlanta or something. I don't know. It doesn't. It matters. It matters. But Kansas City Fed is Colorado, so that's the one that I've taken a shine to. It's what I'm, focused on. So that's the leadership, is the 14. So you got the 12 regional banks, and then you got the Federal Board, and then you got the FOMC, the FOMC. The FOMC is the Federal Open Market Committee. And the Federal Open Market Committee includes all the Fed Board, plus 5 of the presidents from the Dirty Dozen, the 12 regional Fed banks. So it makes, the Fed Board has a shit ton of power. Then the Federal Open Market Committee, the Fed has half the power of that. And then the banks of the Fed, so that's the Fed too. So really the Fed protects themselves, the banks, they don't give a shit about the American people though. So Max Kaiser, he called the Federal Reserve note a fiat debt note. Oh, that fiat debt note? No, he says that this is now the age of Bitcoin. The age of the digital currency is here. And he don't want any more reliance on the fiat debt notes. The Federal Reserve note is free floating fiat. Federal Reserve note is free floating fiat. Those who create and issue money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of a people. So the Federal Reserve System, that's the totality, right? 3,000 private banks across America and probably some in Switzerland and shit. Who the fuck really knows? But 14 entities, the 12 regional banks, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, and the Fed, the Board of Governors, the Fed, the Fed. And that's the totality of what the Fed is. So the Fed orders the U.S. Treasury to print $500 billion. The Fed uses that $500 billion to buy a $500 billion bond, government bond, of which pays the Fed interest. So the Fed is investing in the U.S. government. The Fed is buying treasuries from the U.S. government. So the U.S. government, the U.S. Treasury, gives the Fed a bunch of money. Then the Fed turns around and pays, the Treasury. They pay off all these mortgage-backed securities and treasuries and shit. And because they're paying for all this is interest, right? They're buying, financial tools. So they make interest. Now, the Fed keeps some bonds and sells the other bonds to the public for a fee of 10%. The Fed also buys other loans from other banks. The Fed can do whatever the fuck it wants. The bank can throw $1 trillion over here, $1 billion over there, not give you a dime. The Fed will do whatever the fuck it wants. Now that there's no oversight, we give the bank cash interest free. We give the Fed, excuse me. Our demand deposit, and I like this name, demand deposit, because technically when you give the bank your money, that's not your money. That's a liability to the bank. It's an electronic account, but they take 90% of that money and they loan it out. They only save 10% of it in the Federal Reserve. So in the reserves, they only got 10% of your cash. We give the bank, our cash interest-free, debt-free. Nothing is connected to it. We're not tying it to this or that. But they charge us interest on our own currency, loaning it out to others. So they take the 90% and then they make money on top of. So it's not our currency. They're taking our money and they're lending it out to others. So it's a demand deposit. It's an electronic number, a bank liability, but it's not your cash. It's the banks. Just like in South Park, right? Oh, you're putting your money in the bank and it's gone. That's how the bank, I mean, it's not gone. It's a demand deposit, meaning you go demand it, then they'll have to, produce the cash. But it's a liability to the bank because when you demand it, then they got to, pony up. And it's called a demand deposit because if you demand it, you get it back. It's yours. So those that create and issue money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people. The Federal Reserve makes money from the interest of the government securities it buys. The U.S. dollar is doing pretty good against commodities, emerging market currencies. The dollar had gained on the New Zealand dollar and on the Australian dollar, the Aussie dollar. So the U.S. dollar is beating New Zealand dollar, the Australian dollar by 10, 12%. Quantitative easing was intended to be the equivalent of dropping money out of a helicopter. So you just want to stimulate the economy. I think that's what Ben Bernanke had said about TARP and the Great Recession. And so that would have been a better idea. Just going around and just dropping money all over the fucking country. Banks don't lend out more with their free money. What they do is they invest more stocks, bonds, your house and your land. They pay dividends to stockholders. They're not giving, they're not lending more money. The risk is too high. People are going to default on the mortgages that they have already, so why would they pass out more mortgages? There's also no mechanism to force the Fed to act properly. So basic supply and demand says when you add to the money supply, when you print more dollars up, you're devaluing the dollar. There's more dollars. So your $1 isn't that special. You've lessened the purchasing power of that dollar, and quantitative easing just by design creates inflation. You're just printing up a shit ton of money. You've just taken all of our dollars and lessened it, devalued our dollar. Inflation is when prices and wages, everything just keeps going up and up and up, and nobody can stop it until the money is worth, a continental, it's worth a fiat debt note. Quantitative easing is terrible economics. It's terrible economics, especially for the 1,000 people who own our society. So the 1,000 people, the 1,000 oligarchs, the 1,000 plutocrats who run our society, here is just trillions of dollars. Here's a blank check. Here's a credit card on behalf of the American taxpayer. Have fun, AIG. Have fun, Bank of New York Mellon. Enjoy yourself, State Street. State Street, you deserve to buy yourself something nice. You just got a $1 trillion gift from the American taxpayer. Banks typically invest in stock buybacks and paying out fat dividends to their shareholders. They've stopped the buybacks, but they're still passing out dividends. They cannot stop. No. The reason why they're stopping, people are saying they should stop passing out dividends just to make sure the bank has enough money. Make sure it doesn't, go under. But they're like, we're fucking rich and we got trillions. We could pay out dividends. Wells Fargo's dropped 50%. Wells Fargo says we're going to pay out dividends to the end. We don't give a fuck. So to find out, who actually owns the Fed, you need to find out the presidents, the names, what they represent, get into the, actual structure. You got 12 presidents of the Federal Reserve, the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board, and then you got the, usually 7 members and usually 12 members of the Federal Open Market Committee. The Federal Open Market Committee controls the monetary policy. They control the money supply. They say whether or not we should contract or, expand our money supply. Therefore, since they're the monetary, they should just, drip, 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 just dribble out. That's a good monetary policy, like Milton Friedman said. Drip, drip, drip. Just dribble out. Just print up money supply, just barely enough to cover all the old money that's, damaged, worn out, or irretrievably lost. And then, catch up with population growth and wages and prices and shit. So the economic growth rate, take the economic growth rate into account. And slowly, expand the money supply. You're not expanding if you're replacing the old money. And you're not really expanding if you're keeping up with the population and with, wage and growth and prices and whatnot. So quantitative easing is terrible economics. You're going to get addicted to free money, and you got these, these corporations and these Wall Street fat cats. They're going to get addicted to quantitative easing. They're going to get addicted. So you have, let's see, who is the Federal Reserve? I think, how much stock do they own? Who are they? Where do they come from? Are they billionaires? Are they millionaires? The Fed controls and profits by printing money up through the Treasury. The Federal Reserve began in 1913 with 300 total banksters who became owners at $100 per share in the Federal Reserve banking system. So if you want some, stocks that's going to bring some money back to you, invest in the Fed, right? Them motherfuckers just could print up, money when the international banking cartel. The international banking cartel has more representation in the Fed than the American people do. The Fed claims a monopoly on credit. The Fed collects billions of dollars in annual interest, and the shareholders of the dirty dozen Fed banks get their dividends. 2/3 of all the stocks are owned by 1% of the people. So I'm not sure if Congress. Ron Paul says that the Fed's never been audited, so I think he's saying that the Congress has never been audited because there's lots of independent audits of the Fed. But Alan Greenspan, he says there's independent audits and that they have the cleanest books ever, but then Alan Greenspan, he doesn't really understand what derivatives or credit default swaps are. So when Federal Reserve note, the fiat debt note that's in circulation, when it gets into so the U.S. Treasury prints it, gives it to the Fed. Now the Fed has the Federal Reserve notes, and they put it into the reserves, or they fatten up the reserves, or they put, type in the electronic thing and say, okay, you actually got more reserves than what you have. And then other people come in and take their money, and they take a loan out, and then they're the ones that actually wind up getting. So when the Fed banks, the regional banks, so the Fed gets it, passes out to the 12 regional banks, then that's when the U.S. government is obligated to it and has to back it totally. When the 12 regional banks have it and they slip it into circulation. The Fed can print money via the U.S. Treasury and no interest charged to the Fed. So we give money to the banks, no, interest charged to the banks, we the American people. The Fed, the U.S. Treasury gives the Fed money with no interest charged. The Fed creates money from nothing and loans it back to us through banks and charges interest on our currency. The Fed also buys government debt with their monopoly money and charges U.S. taxpayers on that as well. The Fed can be used for the American people, or it can be against us. So I'm just going to talk about Woodrow Wilson, because 1913 is when the Fed opened. It was designed and signed into law by Woodrow motherfucking Wilson, that low-life piece of shit. Woodrow Wilson, he becomes president, his wife dies. Within 1 year, he remarries somebody else. Did you take enough time to mourn? Did you really love her, Woodrow? Seems like you kind of maybe only wanted it anyways. So there's a rumor about a donkey, a jackass. Woodrow Wilson is a snobby, racist, elitist. He's a segregationist piece of shit. He segregated the White House. He's an imperialist, invaded Mexico. He didn't keep us out of war. He's the one that got us into war. Woodrow Wilson was 100% against free speech, the Sedition Acts, and the Espionage Act. Woodrow Wilson was such a piece of shit in World War I. He said, you can't speak out against the war. We all got to be behind this war. He threw countless of Americans in jail for being opposed to World War I. Charles Schenck, Robert Goldstein, Eugene Debs, he threw some Abrams, he threw some Russians into jail, or his Espionage Act threw these Russians into jail for just throwing out a flyer outside of a window. So they're all thrown in jail for speaking out against the war, or in Robert Goldstein's case, he just painted the British up in a negative light for his movie called The Spirit of 76, a movie about the American Revolutionary War. How are you going to make, an American movie about American Revolutionary War with the British in a positive light? That's how sick and backwards and fucked up Woodrow Wilson was. You can't make a movie about the American War. You can't talk about truth and then then on the flip side, when he saw the movie Birth of a Nation, he says that's writing history with lightning. Oh, because in Woodrow Wilson's mind, the KKK were the saviors of the poor and battered and tattered white supremacist South. So he's got a fucked up understanding of history. He doesn't understand that the American Revolutionary, we fought the British in America, but they were our allies in World War I, so you can't say, are you kidding? Oh, free speech, that's, you know, the quintessence, that's all about being an American. If you don't have free speech, you can't say you're an American. When he segregated the White House, it, you know, signaled to the entire country segregation was still the law of the land. Fuck Woodrow Wilson. This is the guy. This is the asshole who organized the Federal Reserve, a stuck-up aristocratic elitist, wore a top hat like those old capitalist fucks of yesteryear, right? Like the Monopoly guy. So when they first came up with the Fed, Woodrow Wilson was saying that it checks Wall Street, it checks spending, we need a centralized bank. I think in general we need a centralized bank. But he was essentially saying that the Federal Reserve is going to be decentralized, the 12 regional banks are going to be decentralized, so therefore it's more democratic and more honest, and it's more about the people. So it's for the people and against Wall Street, according to Woodrow Wilson at the time. Now maybe it is. Maybe it's, you know, maybe it's for Wall Street. Maybe it's against the people. Maybe it could have started out as a good idea. But over time, among Americans, I mean, who actually amongst us understands monetary policy and the financial, economic, legal, and political systems of America to know enough to know how to invest in U.S. treasuries and commercial paper and mortgage-backed securities effectively to make a profit and to not take a bath? Not many. Not many. And so I think the financial industry has slowly seeped in. Even if you could say it started out good, this is definitely for Wall Street, and it's definitely against the people. The Federal Reserve does not represent America. It doesn't represent Americans. It's, you know, bigger than the three branches of government. Give me control of the money supply. I care not who makes the laws. It's Rothschild. Andrew Jackson says if the American people understood how the system worked, there would be a revolution by morning when it comes to the banking and monetary system. So, yeah, the Fed. More on the Fed coming up.